Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. My guest today is Jason Burke, who spent decades reporting on political violence, extremism, and conflict across the world. His latest book, The Revolutionists, the story of the extremists who hijacked the 1970s, takes us back to a decade where aircraft hijacking and hostage taking were all too common, at least relatively. It also covers some of the wider consequences of how the world woke up to a new form of radical fundamentalism. Thank you very much, Jason, for joining me on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Abhishek, for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Thank you. And I was listening to one of your other podcasts where you talked about how you started with the idea of writing a book about ISIS, but then, correct me if I'm wrong, you went back because you thought that this 1970s hijacking was far more fascinating. Tell us about how you went about choosing this subject in the first place.
I was commissioned to write a book about ISIS about 10 years ago when ISIS were at their peak. I did write the book eventually, but as I tried to find a way of writing the book, I experimented with various kind of structures and ideas and so forth. And one of them ended up being a sort of short history of Islamic militancy and Islamic extremism, which is quite an interesting exercise. It wasn't a very good book. It didn't really work. And in the end, I wrote something different for the publishers who wanted the book. But that got me thinking about the kind of deep roots of radical violence and extremist violence, particularly the kind of thing we were seeing in that period, so 10 years ago with ISIS, and how you can trace it, a lot of it back to the late 60s. And I was thinking about how to do this and how to write about it. I know that the 90s have been fairly well covered. I've written about the 90s myself and the kind of rise of Al-Qaeda. The 80s have been fairly well covered by people like Steve Cole writing Ghost Wars about the war in Afghanistan and so forth. But where there seemed to be a big gap, and I was looking for a good book on it, was the 70s, which is obviously largely before Islamic militancy really broke into public consciousness, which was the late 70s, early 80s, really, 81, 82. And I was very interested in looking at that moment before, when the wave of nationalist, largely secular, left-leaning violence of that period faded away and a new type of violence replaced it.
There are a bunch of characters that you trace in your book, these militants or terrorists or operators, what now that you would like to prefix them with, but each has its own story. But was there a reason why hijacking peaked so dramatically in the 1970s? Was it geopolitics, a bit of media, aviation? There were movies as well. What exactly happened back then?
Well, there were lots of hijackings in the 60s. In America particularly, but they weren't political on the whole. They were criminals or people with kind of mental health issues or people who wanted to travel to Cuba, actually, just wanted to get a way of flying from the US to Cuba. And it was really in the last years of the 60s that hijacking became kind of popularised, if you like, as a terrorist tactic. So you had people who saw this as an opportunity, who actually decided to use hijacking as a tactic as part of a broader campaign that they saw as useful in a strategic way. And they were primarily the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So there are other Palestinian factions involved, but primarily the PFLP. And they saw it as useful in different ways. One was it was very high profile. So it made people aware of their grievances. It was also a way of damaging Israel, which post-67 they were particularly keen on doing because the Arab states have proven incapable of doing that. And they started doing this at a time when aviation had expanded enormously, when infrastructure of aviation had expanded enormously and was almost entirely unprotected. Security was really very, very basic if there was any. Airports were designed like train stations. You could basically just walk onto a plane. And the other important factor was that governments were completely unprepared. They had absolutely no idea that this was a strategic terrain, if you like, that this could be exploited. And when there were hijackings, simply didn't know how to respond. They didn't even have a vocabulary to describe hijackers. They called them air pirates, skyjackers, all sorts of things. And they negotiated very often and often fulfilled the demands of the attackers. So there were a variety of factors that meant for about 5 years maybe a bit longer, depends where and who you look at, but certainly between, say, 1969 and 1977, it was quite a successful and quite a effective tactic. Afterwards, it became much less so, but by then, the films you talk about are all about events that happened in that period.
Yeah, you talk about not having the correct vocabulary or the security being lapse at the time. I found it interesting in your book. You talk about how it wasn't even considered a crime as such, meaning there was one Vietnam veteran about whom you write who hijacked a plane in the US, and I think was it in Italy where they merely charged him with the possession of an unlicensed firearm. So the world was also waking up to it, was it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Italian was an Italian-American who hijacked a plane and flew it to Rome and was greeted as a hero by Romans, by the Italians. And otherwise, so when Layla Khalid attempted to hijack a El Al plane from Amsterdam to the east coast of the US in 1970, in September, she ended up in the UK because the hijacking went wrong and she was overpowered, as was her partner, who was fatally shot by an Israeli air marshal. And she ended up in a West London police station being held there. But the only thing they could actually really charge her with was entry without a visa. It was immigration offences. Because there wasn't actually a crime for attempting to take over a plane in British airspace, because they did it in the air over Britain, obviously, and so it was very unclear what crime she'd actually committed. It was also fairly clear that if they prosecuted her, they would invite some kind of reprisal from her group, the PFLP. And so they didn't want to do it, and they released her quite quickly. But there was the sort of legal framework wasn't there, and it started being put in place. I mean, there were a few laws, but nothing very robust, and certainly nothing that could be internationally used. And that started coming in during the following decade.
And yet the frequency of hijacking was such that even pilots, you write, were trained about how to respond to such an event. I think the incident that you just said, or if I may be conflating with another, where the pilot of the aircraft in which Leila was in, he nosedived in a steep drop so that passengers who were still strapped on didn't get hurt, but the hijackers were taken to task. Was it the same incident? Where pilots were trained to do this, which is fascinating.
Well, only the Israeli pilots. So the Israelis took a much more robust view of these things, and they had air marshals on board who were armed, and their pilots were trained in kind of evasive tactics like the one that you mentioned, described there, that put the plane into a very steep dive. The hijackers are probably moving around. They'll fall and tumble down the passageways of the plane, probably injure themselves, certainly be in a position where they could be overpowered, whereas the passengers are all still strapped in and the flight crew, so they'll be fine. So that was certainly what the Israelis were trained to do. But everyone else was told just to do whatever they want. Do not resist. There was no way they could resist. Once they're on the plane, I mean, what are they going to do? And the real point was that they didn't have anybody who could take over the plane. So there were no. This happened later. The Israelis pioneered it in 1972, but other Western powers only developed the capability during the decade, and that was the ability to send a team of specially trained either police or soldiers onto the plane. In these instances, it could be an embassy that's been taken over, for example, or whatever. But I mean, using these specialist units to resolve a terrorist attack, that capabilities just simply didn't exist in 1970 or even as late as 74, 75 in some places. So the governments just didn't have any choice but to negotiate in many ways.
And was Israel always among the exceptions that they chose not to negotiate? Would that be a generalized statement?
They did once early on, and then they didn't again in these circumstances. But it has to be said that the Israelis have a long history of releasing prisoners if they want to have hostages returned, even the remains of hostages, as we've seen in Gaza in the last 3 years. So they do negotiate. But in these instances, they refused point blank to release prisoners. So what was happening was the Palestinian factions would take a plane full of Swiss, French, German, British, whoever, Americans, and the hijackers would then ask the Israelis to release prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, and that in order to have all these other nationalities released. Sometimes they'd ask for their own prisoners, jailed Palestinians in, say, Switzerland or Germany or France or wherever, to be released too. Sometimes even people who weren't connected, but were from allied armed groups, Western left-wing radical groups. But they would ask primarily for the Israelis to release hundreds of prisoners. And the Israelis would then refuse, and that would cause problems with the other powers who would take a much more pliant position, and so you'd have these arguments between, say, the British and the Israelis, and the British saying, oh, come on, just release a few and then we can get this over with, we'll have our citizens back, and the Israelis saying, no way, we're not releasing anyone. Particularly in 1970, at the big hijacking, the triple hijackings, actually there were 5 planes taken overall, but or attempted to be taken, in 1970 in Jordan, that hijacking, and in that there were no single nationality Israelis involved among the passengers. So the Israelis had no real incentive to release a whole load of prisoners themselves. So, yeah, I mean, it is a point of contention, and the Israelis tended to take a much stiffer line than the others.
You talked very briefly about the Palestinian factions. How many of them were they? And how did they, I mean, in your book, you talk about how some of them coordinated with each other.
I mean, really, the people you are most important, they're not that many. I mean, there was obviously the overarming. First of all, I'm writing about the people who were doing the long-range hijackings. And actually, there were very few. There were less than half a dozen, 3 or 4 groups that got involved in that sort of thing in the period. The main one was really the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And that dropped that strategy very quickly by 1972. It was continued by a breakaway faction from that group, which took a much more extreme position and also was commissioned by people like Gaddafi to conduct some of these attacks. So in terms of the number of factions involved in what they called the armed struggle against Israel, and Israel called terrorism, if you include attacks within Israel, if you include attacks on Israeli interests, and often just straight Jewish communities' interest elsewhere, then there are quite a lot involved. But if you're looking at the high-profile hijackings, or even the high-profile terrorist attacks, like the Munich Olympic attack of 1972, then you're really not looking at very many. You're looking at the Munich Olympic attack was Black September, which was part of Fatah, which was the biggest faction in the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organisation, which was the kind of umbrella organisation. And most of the rest, or a lot of the rest, were PFLP, which was a smaller group, still within the PLO, although its relationship with the PLO was tense sometimes, the PLO leadership. So, I mean, it is very complicated, but really you're not looking at, for those involved in this kind of attack, long-range international terrorism, it was a minority of a minority.
And was Munich the first biggest such attack that got these factions, or the faction that conducted this or orchestrated this, the most amount of, publicity? And was it their plan to execute all of this? Because there is a section in the book where you also write that even the leaders of such factions would be scratching their heads that they have been trained, but whether they will actually go and execute the plan was anybody's guess, because it wasn't like the military where there is a general and the troops have to respond to the, those folks. So was Munich planned such that, I mean, the athletes will be killed, and how did that piece go about?
Well, I didn't want to kill the athletes. That's clear. Athletes, a massacre wasn't what they were after. And the massacre actually occurred in the final minutes after a whole day of this drama playing out. And it happened as the German police attacked the hijackers and the Palestinian attackers who'd taken the hostages in Munich. And that was the point when they were being attacked that the hostages, apart from 2 of them, died. 9 hostages died during the supposed rescue. 2 were killed earlier. So they were certainly prepared to kill hostages. But at Munich, they did not set out to kill hostages. They wanted to, again, release prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, and some others around Europe particularly, and elsewhere in Israel and so forth. And really they wanted publicity. I mean, they wanted to publicise the cause of the Palestinians. And yeah, you're right in that the Black September organisation, which conducted the attack on the Munich Olympics in 1972, as I say, abducted a group of Israeli athletes and coaches and held them ransom. Black September was kind of chaotic in its organisation, in that it was less well organised and less coherent than some of the other groups. But the other groups, people like the PFLP breakaway faction that I write about a lot, were very organised and disciplined. And certainly other groups, other splinter factions and smaller Palestinian factions, they were pretty autocratic. I mean, there was certainly none of this sort of leaderless stuff that comes through later. And there's no, let's inspire people around the world to rise up and conduct their own attacks. I mean, that A, wasn't practical, and B, just didn't occur to anybody as a good idea. It didn't occur to anyone as an idea, full stop, actually. So that's all quite later. And so in that period, most of the attacks were pretty well organised. I mean, they kind of had to be, because there's no communication. You didn't have mobile phones or internet or whatever. So you have to organise it. I mean, you have to give people orders. You have to tell people where they're going to be. You have to absolutely get it very detailed. There can't be any improvisation or kind of last minute instructions. There were instances where there were last minute problems, and it's very complicated to change plans at the last minute, because you've got to tell lots of people, and how do you do that when there's communications are very hard. So on the whole, they were pretty well ordered, and they were pretty disciplined. I mean, people obeyed the hierarchy and the leaders.
I'm not sure about the dates if I'm getting them wrong, but when another plane was hijacked and Operation Thunderbolt, or the one at Entebbe that took place, could you briefly paint a picture of what was happening in Israel at the time in the political parties? Because there is an interesting relationship between the number one and number two there that you paint in your book. Behind the scenes, if you could take us, Munich has happened, and then not long after, a plane again gets hijacked, and they are in a position where they either have to negotiate or storm, and they choose the latter. But there is a bit of tension within the room as well, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of tension, because it's a big decision to make, and nobody's ever done anything like this before, and it's quite unlikely that there's any real success. I mean, it's a long shot, and so there's a lot of discussion, and the Israelis think for a long time. I mean, there's Yitzhak Rabin is the prime minister, Shimon Peres is the defense minister. Peres hasn't got a lot to lose, so he's pushing for an attack. Rabin does have a lot to, because he has the overall responsibility. So he pushes. So there are discussions, and right until the last minute, there are conversations about, other ways of, either trying to rescue or actually really not rescuing, negotiating, and they don't think they've got much choice. And slowly they come up with this plan, which seems extraordinarily difficult and audacious, which is to, they have an Air France plane. Well, there was an Air France plane that is taken it's on its way to Paris via Athens from Tel Aviv. It's got a lot of Israeli citizens on board, a lot of Jewish people. It is hijacked by the PFLP, Palestinian faction. It's flown down to Uganda, to Entebbe, the international airport. It lands there, and over the next few days, most of the non-Jewish passengers are released. And a couple of Jewish passengers are released, but probably by accident. And the hijackers retain around 100 people who are either Israeli or Jewish American, actually. The Israelis have then got the problem, because everyone else's citizens have been freed, and they're just sort of saying, the French and the British and everyone else are just saying, oh look, just negotiate and have done with it. The Israelis don't want to do this. And they come up with this plan that they're going to fly special forces all the way from Israel to Uganda, land in the night, kill the hijackers, rescue the hostages, and fly back again. To fly back, they haven't got the range, so they're either going to have to refuel there from the tanks in the airport, which is extremely difficult because they haven't necessarily got the right technology to match up the pumps and everything. Or they can just about make it to Kenya, which is where they have secured the right, with nobody saying anything, I mean, clandestinely, to land and refuel and all the rest of it, and then make it back to Israel. And they do it, basically. They decide they're going to go for it. The plan looks like it's feasible, and so they dispatch several hundred paratroopers and a much smaller group of elite special forces, and they put it off. They suffer one fatality, who happens to be the leader of the entire operation, Yoni Netanyahu, who is the brother of the current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, of Israel, and they fly all the way back. And it really is a turning point in many, many ways. It's a turning point for the whole practice and strategy and tactic of taking these planes, these hijackings, which suddenly now look like a much worse idea than they did previously. And it's the moment where the PFLP breakaway faction that's been doing all these hijackings, it kind of breaks down and starts to fall apart. It's finished within a year or so. And it's the moment when these new counter-terrorist units start to operate in a competent and professional way. And give policymakers, decision makers, another option when there is one of these kind of incidents. But what's really interesting, and I try to take a global perspective of these things, is with the Entebbe attack, which has been absolutely kind of celebrated as a brilliant example of special forces operations and audacity and courage, which it was. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to have done, and it's a real significant courage from policymakers as well as the soldiers involved. But what tends to get forgotten is the broader context. One thing is it was immensely controversial afterwards, and the whole of the global south, Africa, South Asia, India included, Latin America, the Soviets, all just said, you can't do that. You can't just send a whole bunch of soldiers into another country. That's an invasion. It's a complete infringement of national sovereignty. If you've got a problem somewhere, you have to sort it out through their government, who at the time was Idi Amin in. But the other thing, so it was all about Cold War politics, and the most important thing about Cold War politics is, as I mentioned, the Israelis could not have done it without getting some basing rights in Kenya. And Jomo Kenyatta, who was the president of Kenya at the time, said to his security people, look, let the Israelis do what they need to do. Just don't tell me anything. I don't want to know anything about it. I don't know anything about it. Anybody asks me, I know nothing about it. And what he was doing was balancing the West and the Soviet bloc and the global South, which was largely aligned with the Soviet bloc. And he was doing this kind of trying to keep it neutral, trying to please everybody, keeping the Israelis and the Americans on side, making sure that he didn't annoy other African nations and kind of wild cards like Gaddafi or somebody, or the Soviets who could cause problems, backing, it was a very complicated sort of Cold War dynamic in East Africa. And that has been completely forgotten. So what made Entebbe work, the famous raid on Entebbe work, was, absolutely the special forces and their kind of military side. But much more interesting to me is the broader political moment and the political context at that moment in the Cold War that allowed the Israelis to do what they did. Because if it hadn't been for Kenyatta's decision, it would have been a debacle.
Interesting, because there's another example I'm forgetting where the US had to make friends with at least one Arab country. I don't know which one now, where it was a similar case where they had.
It was the Germans actually. I know what you're referring to. This is a year later, in '77. So this is the kind of last gasp of the PFLP XO, the breakaway group. They hijack on behalf of German leftists, radicals. They hijack a German plane, a passenger plane in Majorca, in the Mediterranean, and they fly it all over the place. Rome, Cyprus, onto Dubai. They land it in Yemen. Now, Yemen was where the PFLP had its base, and they fully anticipated ending the hijacking there, kind of triumphantly, with all their hostages and everything else in Yemen. Except the Yemeni authorities didn't want them to land. They actually ended up landing the plane. Just the pilot said, "We've got to land. We've got no fuel," and they didn't. And they landed the plane basically in the sand in Aden, in what was then the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, and a Marxist state. And even though it was a Marxist state, it still listened. The leaders listened when the Stasi, so the East Germans, said to them, "Do not let that plane land." And now that it's landed, do not let the PFLP, this Palestinian armed group, anywhere near it. And that meant that they were delayed, and it also meant they had to fly somewhere else, and they flew to Mogadishu. And there again, it was Cold War politics that changed the whole dynamic, because the president of Somalia had just decided that he was going to start tilting towards the Americans, as opposed to being pro-Soviet, for another whole series of complicated reasons. And so he did, and to show his goodwill, he allowed the Germans to land their specialist police unit in Mogadishu and attack the plane, kill the hijackers and free all the hostages. So again, all the focus has been on this military stuff, but without the Cold War dynamics behind it and the politics, the military stuff is useless.
Indeed. And in your book, there are also these characters who, one is the geopolitics bit, but you also write about spies. And one character's name is Gunnar Ekberg, if I'm pronouncing the name right, the Swedish spy who infiltrated the radical left-wing movements in Europe. And I think we only...
Ekberg's great,
Yeah. And the life of a spy, what are the things that they need to do? Conceal some pornographic films just to tell us about...
Okay, so this is the 1970s. He's coming from Sweden, where you could get pornography, and he's going to Beirut. Now, he's a spy, but he is supposedly a kind of activist and a student who would never have his own money, enough money to pay for these sort of trips to Beirut. So as a plausible excuse for being able to afford it, or to fund it, to raise these funds, he buys pornography in Sweden, he takes it with him to Beirut, and he sells it in Beirut for a lot, because it's obviously very rare, even in Lebanon in that period. And so this gives him a cover when he goes to see the people he's infiltrating. They've got very good intelligence networks, and they've learnt that he's done this, and they laugh about it, but it helps convince them that he is a bona fide activist, because that's what he's done to raise the money for the trip. So he kind of pays his hotel bill out of this money he's made of selling these blue movies, basically. And that is clever. And I put it in because it's a really good detail. It's a good bit of tradecraft. I mean, it's how spies operate. So he has a kind of plausible cover because of this. Lots of other stuff as well, but I mean, that was one thing that he told me about.
Yeah, I like the one about how he's told just to follow the tune of so if somebody whistles a particular tune, you just have to follow the guy and follow the instructions because he's one of yours. I mean, small things.
Yeah,
these are real things.
It's also the theme from a very famous film about spies and spying and skullduggery that is set in Vienna that everybody would know, and actually is the final scenes of which happen more or less where he is. I mean, it's a sort of lot of references and stuff going on, but it's interesting. I mean, it's the 70s again. This is, they couldn't just sort of, they weren't bleepers, or they weren't kind of internet drop boxes. There was nothing. So they came up with all these various ideas of how to signal to each other, and lots of other things they were doing. But those sorts of things, I mean, they're very analogue. I mean, to us they seem very basic, but they worked. They did work. And I mean, Ekberg got away with about 4 or 5 trips to Jordan, to Lebanon, Egypt as a spy. And he got very close to the leadership of the PFLP, and was able to provide some very interesting and useful information to both his handlers in Sweden and to the Mossad.
Mossad, there's another one where Mossad, we've one little bit where they assassinated someone but made it look as if it was an accident because somebody had left their explosives in the car. It's very devious, but in an era when you could only do so much with stuff, I think that's a different level of...
Yeah, he was a senior terrorist logistics guy. And he was much more as well, actually. But they wanted to kill him in Paris. So they didn't really want to cause a diplomatic incident, but they did want to kill him. So they created a bomb that looked like it might be, or once it had gone off, it would suggest that he had been transporting explosives and that they'd gone off accidentally. Or possibly that another Algerian, he was Algerian, he was involved in a lot of Algerian politics, that possibly some rivals or some people opposed to his Algerian kind of faction might have killed him. So they were laying a false trail, yeah, and that's how they did it, by creating a particular type of bomb that would suggest to anybody investigating that it wasn't them. In fact, it went much further than that, because they were linked to the Mossad at the time, was part of a very high level network that shared information, and they shared information amongst senior members of European intelligence services and the FBI, and as I say, the Mossad. They were all sharing this information, very granular information about individuals that were of interest to them in Europe particularly. And it was called the Kilobot Network. And after this particular murder, there were all these questions and investigations among the various intelligence services in Europe, with them all asking each other, do you have any information on this killing? And the Mossad was sort of saying, no, we don't, but I mean, send us anything you've got and we'll let you know what we think. And so the French, for example, were sending them all their investigation reports going, we think it's rivals within the group, or we think he might have been transporting explosives. And the Mossad was sort of replying, going, oh, do you? Oh, okay, yes, that's probably very likely. You know, when it was we now know that the Mossad had done it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a lot of those kind of, you know, it's a world of mirrors, you know, shadows. I call one of my chapters the Shadow War, which is the kind of war in Europe between the Mossad and the Palestinian factions that was fought out in, you know, with subterfuge and deception. And the Mossad had one agent very badly wounded, another killed when he was trapped after he'd been betrayed by one of his own agents, a source, who was turned by the Palestinians after being turned by the Israelis. And then the Israelis got something very badly wrong and killed a Moroccan waiter in Norway when they were trying to kill a very senior Palestinian security official. It was, you know, I mean, the Israelis won it in the end, but it was a nasty little war fought out completely in the shadows of Europe in the early 70s. So I cover that in a chapter or two.
How did you know what to leave out in a story that is so, you know, wide-ranging? You have 600 pages and it's a page turner. I'm not just saying this because you're on, because it's history that we are not obviously taught in our school or college or elsewhere. How did you know this is the expanse of it? Or if you were given the liberty to write more, would you have covered anything more? Or how did you go about the whole process of putting it all in?
You know, I mean, it's a long book anyway. I mean, there's loads that isn't in it. I try to, you know, you pick what you need in a sense to tell the story you want to tell, make the argument that you want to make. And also there were just some characters that were really important. So, I mean, for example, I had some arguments with my editor over the man I was just talking about, the one who was killed in Paris, Mohammed Boudia. He's a really interesting guy because not only was he a senior figure running a whole series of terrorist networks in Europe, he was also highly cultivated. He was a playwright, he was a gifted actor, he directed a theatre in Western Paris, he translated Molière, French version of Shakespeare, into Arabic, the first ever person to do that. I mean, he was also a philanderer, he was a womanizer, and an amateur poet. He had all different aspects to him. So I wanted to have him as a character because I thought he said something important about these kind of people. They're not just sort of faceless killers. They may do stuff that's absolutely appalling, but there's more to them. And so my editor wanted that. He said we haven't got space for yet another character, so he wanted that to come out. And I said, no, he's really important because he's always been described in all the literature as just a terrorist and a womanizer. And he was both. But there's all this other stuff that I've dug up, mainly because I speak French, so I could go to French sources. And all that stuff that we hadn't seen. Nobody's done that before about him. So we have to keep that in. So those were the sorts of things. I mean, stuff that was new and important, I kept in. Stuff that made my argument, I kept in. Stuff that moved the story along. And stuff that was just great. I mean, stuff that was just really interesting and exciting and gripping. That all stayed in.
Lovely. And last couple of questions. I know we are almost running out of time. Jason, I wanted to ask you, one, you must be in this peculiar position where you can answer this question about the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. And you have a little section in the book where a former CIA, was it director or the boss of the CIA, who had warned that there is a bit of a trend around here that, and that everybody should watch out for. Can you help us understand when did it start, this whole concept, and what illustrated that?
This is Richard Helms, who was a former director of the CIA, was, after falling out with the Nixon administration, was ambassador in Tehran and was doing tours in the Middle East. This is quite early on. This is in the 70s, early 70s, sorry, 72, 73. And he said, it's really interesting what's happening. Islam is really growing in strength. Even leftists are giving, the religious side of things some respect now, paying lip service to religion, he said, but actually it was more than that. So he was very clear that he could see the signs of a new religious resurgence as early as 72, 73. Interestingly, the CIA a year or so later do this report where they say, actually, the era of revolutions in the Arab world is over. In fact, in the Middle East is over. And they were wrong. They just got the wrong kind of revolution. They were thinking about sort of colonels in uniform storming palaces, or communists or whoever. And it wasn't the case that revolution had gone. It was a revolution had been redefined. And it had been redefined with a new vocabulary, a new framing, quite similar enemies in some ways, but in a radically new way. And it was what we still have to an extent now. This was the big wave of Islamic activism was coming through from the late 60s, built in the 70s. And then in 79 you have the Iranian Revolution, and you have the storming of the Great Mosque in Mecca by jihadi militants, basically, messianic Islamic militants who fight a huge battle with Saudi security forces. It's an absolute mess and a great shock to the Saudi royal family. And you then have in 81, you have the assassination of Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt. And these three things are like kind of hammer blows on a bell, kind of ringing out, this is something new that's coming. And I leave the book in 84, 85 with Osama bin Laden, who was inspired by the people who took over the mosque in Mecca, who knew obviously all about what had happened in Iran, as well as the failures of the left, the Arab left in the 70s, to achieve very much anywhere, and its repression. And who, 83, 84, is beginning to formulate some very new ideas about where and how to fight. And interestingly, the enemies are not that dissimilar. It's, America, Israel. I mean, a lot of this project's very different, but there are some strands that take ideas that were much earlier in circulation and expand them and develop them in new ways. So that's where I can end the book, and I'm trying to show the transition from, basically the argument's quite simple. What happens in the Middle East is that you have, for the first half of the 70s, certainly for the 60s, 50s, 60s and the first half of the 70s, you have an ideology that is a revolutionary ideology. It offers social justice. It offers all the things that revolutionary ideologies offer in terms of kind of utopian vision. And it's left-leaning, it's progressive, it's secular, it's nationalist, it's atheist. That is obliterated. It fails. It is destroyed, repressed, it fragments. Lots of leaders make terrible mistakes. It doesn't achieve anything. But the problems are all still there. So there's a vacuum. And what fills it is much worse, basically. You know, the people I was looking at, characters in the book, individuals who are, by 1979 or 1978, sitting down and talking with Western governments about, these are senior people who are responsible for, senior Palestinians responsible for terrorist attacks 5 years earlier. They're sitting down with senior politicians in Europe, even talking to the Americans and the CIA, about cooperation, about intelligence sharing, about recognition of the Palestinians, about all sorts of things. Most of them are killed, either by the Mossad or by other factions on the left. In 1982, the PLO is scattered when the Israelis invade Lebanon. What do you get immediately afterwards in Lebanon? Hezbollah, an Islamic militia that's 10 times worse than anything that they'd faced previously. What do you get in Gaza? Hamas, which is beginning to, I mean, it starts in a different way, but it's formed in 1987, but its antecedents are there by the early 80s. So that's the argument in many ways of the book is, you know, if you destroy opposition, if you eradicate terrorists, which you need to do, but you don't give them any kind of political channel to express any grievances, you don't allow populations some kind of way of hoping for redress of the various grievances that they have, well then you'll kill off one generation of terrorists, you'll just get another one. And there's absolutely no guarantee that it's going to be easier to deal with than the one before. In fact, it's much more likely to be harder.
And you have to write a story rooted in fact. Of course, there is a deadline, and you've seen stuff that ordinary people will never be willing to or privy to. How do you go about that process? How easy or difficult is it for you as a journalist or as a reporter when you write stories which are a little difficult to report on?
Yeah. Well, I'm a kind of journalist, author, historian, and all those things involve, in terms of what I do, specifically because of the material I'm dealing with and the period I'm dealing with, talking to people. So I spoke to a lot of perpetrators, terrorists, former terrorists, to do the book. I spoke to spies, I spoke to others. And, you know, my job as a journalist, as a reporter, is talking to people and not so much getting them to talk to me, because I don't interrogate people, you can't. I mean, it's more about finding the approach that convinces them that they want to be involved, that they want to help, they want to talk to you about what happened to them. Now, a lot of the people I spoke to who had done really kind of bad things in the 70s were very happy to talk, partly because they don't see them as bad things. They're usually quite proud of them. And also because a lot of them are old now, they're in their 80s, and they want to talk about the times what they did in their youth and when they were, in their minds, doing great things as young people. So they were often quite easy to convince. Some of them were much harder because they're still very much involved in their views. In fact, virtually everybody I spoke to had barely changed in terms of their kind of overall outlooks. And it's just a case of I'm always honest. I say who I am, what I'm doing. Can they help me out? One thing that I found helped with some was that I knew my stuff. You know, first of all, they sort of think, oh, who's this guy turning up? And then when they work out, actually, you've done a lot of legwork and you really do know a lot of what's happening there. And in fact, you probably have a better idea of it than they do. Then they often are much happier to talk. I mean, kind of Mossad guys I spoke to were definitely like that. Some of the Palestinian former security officials. Others see themselves still as part of the struggle they were involved with, and they want to talk because they want to make their views known. They're often less useful as interviewees, but it was a great experience in terms of being able to talk to people who were actually there. I mean, you know, it's like being a historian of whatever period in, you know, Britain or US or India, and being able to travel back in time and talk to the people who were actually there at the Battle of Panipat or, you know, whatever, the American Revolution or something, and actually ask them, so what was it like? Why did you get involved? Why, you know, who was this major character, major ruler or major individual like when you were around him? I mean, it was great. I mean, that was a fantastic experience, and it was a really valuable one and a privilege.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Jason, for your time on the podcast, and congratulations yet again on your book. Really loved reading it. Thank you.
That's a pleasure. That's great. That's great.
Thank you.
No, it's a pleasure talking to you, Abhishek. Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity. Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.